Yali Madad, and welcome to everyone joining us from across Canada. Thank you for being part of today's webinar. We will be discussing about the benefits, requirements, and the process of applying for Canadian citizenship. I'm Farkhanda Niazi, currently serving as National Communications Lead for Settlement Portfolio, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Please send us your questions online, and we'll make sure we address as many of them as we can. You can also send us an email and we will respond to them accordingly. Before we get into the session, we will have a few words from Turaj Molai. A little bit about Turaj. Turaj has been serving on the National Settlement Portfolio since 2015, currently as the National Deputy. His other institutional experience includes serving as a board member for ITRIP for Prairies and as Vital Ilm Facilitator. Professionally, Turaj is an engineer and works as a director at the environmental consulting firm that helps companies reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Turaj will be spending a few minutes talking about the settlement portfolio and the programs and services we offer. Turaj.
Thank you, Farkhanda. Yadi Madad, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this citizenship information session. We hope you and your families are keeping well and staying safe during this global pandemic. I will spend a few minutes telling you about the settlement portfolio. But first, I wanted to clarify and confirm that despite the ongoing pandemic, all of our volunteers on the settlement portfolio continue to work to bring the Jamaat the necessary services and support, along with all other boards, portfolios, and institutional services. We have been rethinking how to engage with the Jamaat to ensure we can provide the same level of service as before and to respond to the Jamaat's changing needs under this crisis. This Citizenship Information Session webinar is an example of how we are working to reach the Jamaat in new ways. Although you cannot approach us in person, within our Jamaat khanas, which are currently closed, we encourage you to still reach out to us if you have any questions regarding this session, or if you have questions about other settlement portfolio services. You can contact Zia directly for questions regarding the session, or you can contact one of our regional settlement members listed here. These contacts will also be provided at the end of the session. Also, any inquiries that are made through the access line that relate to the settlement portfolio will be received by our team, and we will work to respond in a timely manner. The settlement portfolio offers services and programming to support Jamaat who have immigrated to Canada to enable their successful integration into Canadian society and their integration within the Jamaat. Our services aim to support the Jamaat as they go through various phases of the settlement process. We generally consider this process to involve 4 phases. The first is pre-arrival, where Marids are still in their country of origin, or if they are refugees, it may be their first country of asylum. The second is the newly arrived phase, covering their first year in Canada. The third phase is newly settled, which is years 2 to 3 of being in Canada. And the fourth phase is settled, which involves years 4 and beyond. As Jamaati members move through these phases, their needs will change from basic things such as housing, employment, language training, and basic legal requirements to more complex needs such as obtaining citizenship, pursuing longer-term career and educational goals that help to enhance their quality of life of themselves and their families, as well as other complex needs such as sponsoring other family members and building capacity to contribute to the Jamaat and the broader society. Our programming and services are developed and designed with these phases in mind. I would like to now briefly touch on 4 key areas of our programming or services. These include pre-arrival support, newcomer support, citizenship, and immigration. Under pre-arrival support, the settlement portfolio works with other boards and portfolios, Focus Canada, and the national councils across the world to provide information to Jamaati members who will be immigrating to Canada or who are seeking to immigrate to Canada. This information is meant to prepare these Jamaati members for settlement into Canada and can include things such as language skill requirements, options for immigrating through economic and educational pathways, as well as the required skills for these pathways, and other general information to prepare Murids for arrival to Canada. In particular, under the current circumstances, there may be individuals or families whose arrival to Canada has been delayed or canceled due to COVID-19, and they are experiencing challenges. The settlement portfolio can work with Focus or other national councils to provide them support. The settlement portfolio provides newcomer support to newly arrived Jamaat by facilitating access to essential resources such as housing, education, employment, health needs, language courses, and other valuable skills development. These resources can come from Jamaati institutions, government, or from external agencies. Under the citizenship area, we help to educate the Jamaat on the requirements and the benefits of Canadian citizenship through seminars and webinars such as this one. The rules around obtaining citizenship and the process itself are constantly changing, so keeping the Jamaat informed of these changes is an important and continuous effort for us. Where there may be barriers for some Jamaati members to obtain citizenship, we help to find solutions to overcome these barriers. With regards to immigration, the settlement portfolio can provide guidance to Jamaati members on the various immigration pathways, which fall under 4 categories. The first, refugees, which includes the Group of 5 sponsorship. Then there's also family reunification, economic immigrants, and international students. We aim to keep the Jamaat informed about these changes to immigration rules and regulations. In particular, during this COVID-19 crisis, there are changes that impact temporary and permanent residency, as well as refugees and citizenship. For Jamaati members who are or whose family members are experiencing challenges in their immigration status while in Canada, they can get professional advice and support from subject matter experts at the settlement portfolio. The Management Training Program, or MTP, and the Rahe Kamyabi Initiative, or RKI, are 2 other programs offered by the settlement portfolio. The focus of MTP is to help participants develop leadership and management skills and to build institutional capacity for graduates of the program to enable them opportunities to serve the Jamaat. RKI is a mentorship and goal-setting program whereby participants or mentees are paired with mentors from the Jamaat. The program's one-on-one mentorship and customized workshops help the participants work towards achievement of their professional, career, or educational goals. Both of these programs typically run once a year. The settlement portfolio is working to offer virtual or digital versions of these programs. Now, to tell you about some exciting future webinars from the settlement portfolio, in the coming weeks, we are hoping to offer a Farsi version of this webinar, a seminar with information on Group of 5 sponsorship, and a Laws of the Land seminar in collaboration with Conciliation and Arbitration Board. The dates for these sessions are not determined yet, but once confirmed, they will be marketed on Al Akbar, II Canada, and social media channels. Lastly, I wanted to touch on the importance of having this citizenship webinar today. Aside from the many benefits of having citizenship and the risks of not having it, which will be covered by Zia, we need to remind ourselves how important citizenship is to Maulana Hazir Imam. We have heard in many firmans where Maulana Hazir Imam has asked Jamaat living in Canada to make Canada their home. I would like to read you an excerpt from Maulana Hazir Imam's speech at the foundation ceremony for the Ismaili Center Toronto on May 28, 2010. And I quote, "Let me begin by expressing my profound appreciation for the great honor which this country has paid to me today by extending this generous gift of honorary Canadian citizenship. I have been deeply moved by your gracious gesture, which I also regard as a tribute to the institution of the Ismaili Imamate, which I represent. It is a significant recognition of the values which our community of faith shares with the people of Canada. Mr. Prime Minister, I have always felt very much at home in Canada, but never more so than at this moment, end quote. I hope this excerpt, along with Hazram's guidance in his farmans, reinforces the importance of being a citizen of Canada and the importance of obtaining citizenship for all Jamaat who are eligible. I will now pass it back to Farkhunda to introduce our speaker. Thank you, and Yali Madan.
Thank you very much, Turaj. Our next presenter is Zia Sumar. Zia's practice encompasses all areas of economic immigration through temporary and permanent residence applications, in addition to citizenship. She assists a broad array of clientele in the economic streams and specializes in providing immigration planning strategies to large multinational organizations and corporations, as well as the small and medium-sized enterprise sector. She conducts informational presentations on immigration programs and has been invited to present across Canada and the United States. Zia is an active member of Canada's legal and immigration communities. She has argued in federal court, the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada, and stands as citizenship and immigration lead and subject matter expert for the National Settlement Portfolio. She's also an executive committee member of the Citizenship and Immigration section of the Ontario Bar Association. With that, I ask you that you give full attention to Zia as she presents to you today's session. During the presentation, feel free to send us your questions. There is a chat option on the webinar screen. You can send your questions there and we will address as many of them as we can. Please limit your questions to general questions and those pertaining to Canadian citizenship. Other questions can be emailed to us. Please be aware that this session will be recorded and will be soon shared on iicanada.org/webinars. You can watch the recording as well and send us email to your respective regional members. You can also call us through Access Line and you will be directed to one of our members. Zia will now proceed with the session. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Farkhunda, and Yali Madat, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for the session on citizenship. So before we dive right in, I just want to go over what it is that we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to start by looking at the benefits of citizenship. So why is it that we should be applying and obtaining our Canadian citizenship? We're going to look at the requirements in order to be eligible to apply for citizenship. And with that, we'll also look at the changes that came about in 2017 that made it actually easier for us to apply for citizenship today. We're also then going to look at the process of applying, so what we need to be doing in order to submit that citizenship application and subsequently, of course, obtain citizenship. And lastly, we're going to go through some of the frequently asked questions that we on settlement have been receiving. And of course, like Farkhunda mentioned, we're going to have an opportunity then to open it up and answer the questions that you have posed today in the questions box. So with that, let's dive right in. So first, we're going to look at the benefits. So why is it that we should be applying for citizenship? Of course, Duraj did mention that it's been highly emphasized by Maulana Hazri Imam, and while that's enough on its own, I do want to look at the benefits of having citizenship for a Jamaati member, for any individual. So when we're talking about citizenship and being a Canadian citizen, there's a huge difference in being a permanent resident and being a citizen. Okay, with citizenship, you don't have to constantly be renewing your PR cards, right? So as a permanent resident right now, you hold a PR card. Generally, those are valid for a period of 5 years. At the end of that 5 years, you need to be submitting an extension application, getting that renewal of that PR card. But with citizenship, your passports generally, you can apply to have them valid for 10 years. And of course, with that passport comes huge benefits when it comes to traveling, right? So right there, we see two huge benefits. We don't have to be looking at renewing that PR card constantly. And second, we hold a Canadian passport. Being a citizen also does not have residency requirements. So as a permanent resident, in order to maintain your status as a permanent resident in Canada, you need to physically reside in Canada for 2 out of any 5-year period. Okay, it's an important thing to note, because if you're outside of Canada as a permanent resident for an extended period of time, unless you fall under one of the very limited exceptions, there's a chance that you could lose your status as a permanent resident. Whereas once you become a citizen, that no longer applies. So Canadian citizens are able to reside inside or outside of Canada, and they don't have to constantly be monitoring the number of days that they are physically present in Canada. Okay, so huge benefit, not looking at residence requirements when you're a citizen. We've also heard in Hazard for Months about being able to give back to our countries of origin, right? And that's really, we're able to do that. It's facilitated by being a citizen, because again, we don't have to worry about residence requirements once you're a citizen of Canada. The third benefit of being a citizen, of course, you have a say, right? You have the ability to vote, you can work in federal government jobs, and you can hold political office. That one's very self-explanatory. Our fourth benefit for being a citizen of Canada is that for those individuals who have obtained their permanent residence status through one of the refugee programs, if they're going back, if they're traveling to their country of origin from which they've claimed asylum, it is extremely problematic. As a permanent resident, there is the possibility to lose your status as a permanent resident if you're going back to your country of origin. CBSA, Canada Border Services Agency, has made a huge push in this area. Okay, they're actively looking for individuals who are going back to their countries. And even if you're going back for short visits, so going back for a wedding, for a funeral, to see an elderly family member, any trip back to a country of origin can be extremely problematic for permanent residents who have arrived in Canada and become permanent residents through one of the refugee programs. Lastly, as a citizen, you are subject to Canadian criminal laws, but the added, when you're a permanent resident, there's the possibility of losing your status as a permanent resident should you be charged and convicted of certain serious criminal offenses. That does not apply for citizens. Now, while I'm not saying anything about going out and doing anything, it is something to note, especially with recent changes to our criminal law. It has been extremely problematic for individuals who are permanent residents and unfortunately are facing these changes and are now facing problems with their permanent resident status. So with that, now that we all want to become citizens of Canada, let's look at what the requirements are. So how can we be eligible to apply for citizenship? Well, first, of course, you have to be a permanent resident of Canada. Okay, before we can apply for citizenship, we need to be permanent residents. Okay, and we need to hold status, valid status as a permanent resident. Second, there's a residency requirement. So the physical presence for eligibility for citizenship is that you need to have resided in Canada for 3 out of the past 5 years. So that's a total of 1,095 days in Canada in the last 5 years. Now, that is cumulative. It is not consecutive. So it does not mean that you have to spend 3 years continuously in Canada. There is still the ability to travel, but in total, you need to have 1,095 days physically in Canada in order to be eligible to apply for citizenship. Now, time that you've spent as a temporary resident, if that falls within the past 5 years, that may count towards your physical presence requirement. Okay, so let's say you became a permanent resident 3 years ago. Okay, And for 2 years before that, you were a temporary resident of Canada. Well, that time as a temporary resident may count towards your eligibility for residency if you held valid status. And the way that it's counted is that every day that you spent as a temporary resident is equivalent to half a day towards your physical presence requirement for citizenship, up to a maximum of 1 year. So if you spent 2 years in the past 5 years as a temporary resident, you may be eligible for a total credit of a year. So when we apply that to the total requirement of 3 years, that means that an individual, if they spent 2 years as a temporary resident, may only need to be a permanent resident in Canada for 2 additional years before they can qualify to apply for citizenship. The third requirement is that an individual must file their taxes in Canada if they are required to do so by the Income Tax Act for the period of 3 years that they are using towards their physical presence requirement. Okay, so in short, if you are required by the Income Tax Act to be filing your taxes in Canada, then it will also be a requirement in order to be eligible for citizenship that you're also filing your taxes. For applicants that are between the ages of 18 and 54, they must also complete a language test and a Canadian knowledge test. Okay, now we'll get a little bit more into this when we talk about the process of the application, but for the language test, that's part of the eligibility when we're submitting the application. And there's 2 areas that you have to be able to demonstrate. That is speaking and listening. And you need to be able to demonstrate the Canadian level benchmark of 4 in each of these categories in order to be eligible to submit your citizenship application. And lastly, you must not have committed a crime either inside or outside of Canada. And that really goes back to still holding your status as a permanent resident. So these are the requirements, right? Fairly straightforward. These are the eligibility requirements in order to determine if you are eligible to submit your application for citizenship. Now, in 2017, we saw a number of important changes, okay? And yes, it was 3 years ago, but we're still going to go over it today because there's still a lot of confusion as to what qualifies and what applies to the eligibility requirements. So in terms of qualifying, it's those 5 requirements that we talked about just right now. And what we saw in 2017 is that the government removed the intent requirement, okay? So prior to that, prior to 2017, prior to these changes to the Citizenship Act, you had to demonstrate that you had an intent to reside in Canada after you receive citizenship. That's no longer the case today. So if you're applying today, you're not declaring any intent to continue residing in Canada. We also saw that there was a change in age. Okay, so before a minor needed to have the discretion, needed to have the minister provide the discretion to waive the requirement for age. Today, that's no longer the case, and minor can still apply for citizenship, even if they're applying without a Canadian parent. When we talked about the eligibility requirements, we said that you needed to have 3 out of the past 5 years. It used to be 4 out of the past 6 years. So what we saw in 2017 was that there was a decrease in the amount of time that you had to spend as a permanent resident before you qualify to submit that citizenship application. And linked to that, prior to 2017, we were not counting any time as a temporary resident towards meeting that physical presence requirement. So like we said, today, any day that you've spent as a temporary resident within the past 5 years counts as half a day towards the physical presence requirement, up to a maximum credit of 1 year. Linked to that physical presence requirement, the income tax requirement used to be that you needed to submit your taxes for 4 out of the 6, but because the physical presence requirement changed, there was also a change in how or what the taxes were that you had to file. And so today, it's 3 out of the past 5 years, or it really just depends on when the days are, or where the days are that you've spent and that you're using towards the physical presence requirement. There was also a really confusing requirement that any year that you wanted to use towards meeting that physical presence in the past, you had to have spent at least 6 months in that calendar year in order for any part of that year to count towards your physical presence. That's no longer the case, so don't worry about it. Very confusing requirement in the past. That's no longer a problem today or since 2017 when these changes came to be. And then lastly, the last change that I want to talk about is that the language and the knowledge test was for anyone between the ages of 14 to 64. As of 2017, they've decreased that. It's now 18 to 54. So applicants who are over 50 or 55 and over don't have to worry about submitting or qualifying under the language and knowledge requirements. It used to be 64, now it's been brought down to 54. So huge benefit for anyone who's 55 or older and wants to apply. Don't really need to worry about that language or having to take that citizenship test. So let's switch over to the process, right? We've gone through the eligibility requirements. We know that we're eligible. What do we do, right? How do we submit that citizenship application? Well, first, really important is to verify, go back, take a look at that eligibility requirements again, make sure that you qualify, right? One of the biggest mistakes we see is not calculating the days properly or not being sure that you meet that 1,095 threshold. Very important. With the application, when you're submitting it, you will need to put in either the physical presence form or the online calculator. So what I advise people to do is just to start using that earlier, or you can even use a travel journal, right, to log the dates that you've been entering and exiting Canada. That helps when you're trying to complete the physical presence calculator. It gives you a sense of how many days you've spent inside of Canada, and it'll let you know exactly when it is that you will qualify and meet that 1,095 days. The second thing to do, so we've gone through it, we've said, yes, we're eligible, we've documented all our travel dates, we know that we have well over the 1,095 days. The next step is to look at the documents, right? Look at the documents that IRCC has required for the application and understand what constitutes a complete application, okay? So Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada publishes a document checklist for every application, including their citizenship application. It lists out the application forms and the mandatory documents in order for your application package to be considered complete. Now, with that being said, it's a starting point, okay? You really want to make sure that anything that you're putting in the application, that you're claiming in the application, is well documented, okay? I always advise people, think of that document checklist that IRCC has published as a starting point, right? That's really the absolute minimum that you need to be submitting in order for IRCC to actually process your application. So if you're missing something on that document checklist, your application will be returned to you as incomplete, okay? But like I said, that document checklist should really be a starting point in terms of preparing your package that goes for review, okay? You really want to make sure that you are showing your physical presence, that you're showing any travel, because that's what an officer is going to be looking for when they're evaluating your application and in really reviewing the travel dates that you've put in that application package. When you're putting it together, when you have that application package ready, always go back and make a final look. Go back and review it one final time just to make sure, because the process is long, okay? Your application process is long, and you don't want to find out that you're missing something or have to restart the application, 6 months in, because that means you're going to the back of the line and having to go through that entire process from the start again. So really important, review the documents that you need at the outset, but when you're ready to submit it, make sure you take one final look at it, review all your application forms, review the documents that you're submitting, make sure you have all your bases covered before that application goes in. And at the same time, what I always do is I go back to IRCC's website when I'm ready to submit an application, and I make sure that nothing has been updated. IRCC does not let people know when they've updated a form or changed their document checklist, if they require something new. None of that is published generally anywhere. It is the onus on checking is on the applicant. So go back, take a look at the application form, make sure that you are submitting the most updated application forms when you're preparing that application to go out. You've reviewed everything, you know it's perfect, you know it's ready to go. Don't forget to pay your application fees, right? So you can go online to IRCC's fee payment page, pay that application fee, print out the fee receipt, and submit that with your application, okay? Now, what happens is that application goes in, right? Now it's on IRCC. The first thing you're going to receive from Immigration Canada is that they're going to review to ensure that it's a complete application, okay? They're going to go through it, they're going to compare it to the document checklist that they have, and they're going to triage it to say which applications are complete and which ones are incomplete. Like I mentioned earlier, the incomplete applications get returned to the applicant, but complete applications will receive, the applicant will receive an email confirming that application has been received and that it's now in processing. This email is called an acknowledgement of receipt. So IRCC is letting you know that they've received your application, it's complete, and it's now being processed, or it's in queue to be processed. For applicants that are between the ages of 18 and 54, the next thing you'll receive is an invitation to appear for your citizenship test, okay? So that's the knowledge portion, that's the Canadian knowledge portion of the application. So if you remember, if we go back to the eligibility requirements, we said that for applicants between the ages of 18 and 54, there was both a language and a Canadian knowledge component. Well, in your initial application, you need to be able to demonstrate that you meet the language component, right? So there are specific documents that you can submit with your application to demonstrate that you meet that minimum requirement. At the initial application stage, when you're mailing in your application, it will not have anything to do with the Canadian knowledge portion, okay? That comes afterwards, so it's step 6. Once IRCC has acknowledged that they've received your application, the next step for applicants between the ages of 18 and 54 is that they'll receive a notification to appear for their citizenship test. That's done, test has been passed, right? We're on our way to citizenship. Right after the citizenship test, and for those who do not need the citizenship test, the next step will be appearing for the citizenship ceremony. So all applicants, regardless of your age, will need to attend a citizenship ceremony in order to actually become citizens. So your application gets approved, but you don't become citizens until you attend your citizenship ceremony and take the oath of citizenship at that ceremony. So that's the point in time when you officially become citizens of Canada, okay? Overall, this entire process is expected to take, on average, 12 months. Now, it varies, of course, between applicants. If IRCC considers your application to be non-routine, so if there's something, for example, missing or they want further information, that processing time can be much longer. But for majority of applications that are routine, the average processing time is 12 months. And so that's from the time that the application is submitted to the ceremony date. So a total of 12 months between then. Important that throughout this entire process, okay, so from the time that you've checked your eligibility requirements till that oath ceremony, make sure that you maintain your eligibility requirements, okay? So that includes maintaining your status as a permanent resident of Canada. Now, if this process for some reason takes a number of years, important to make sure that your permanent resident status is still valid at the time that you are that your application is finalized and you want to take go to your citizenship ceremony, because it is still part of the criteria that throughout the entire process until you become a citizen of Canada, that you maintain your permanent residence status. So that's the process, okay? That's what we would need to be going through in order to submit and become citizens of Canada. What I want to spend a couple minutes on is some questions that we've received in the past from a number of individuals. And so before we get into the Q&A portion, I just want to go through these frequently asked questions. So the first one is, I'm still a citizen of another country. Will I lose that citizenship if I become a Canadian? So under Canadian law, a Canadian is allowed to be a citizen of another country as well. So Canada does not require that you renounce citizenship in another country in order for you to become a citizen of Canada. However, with that being said, you do need to look at the laws of your original country of citizenship to see if that there are any issues, or if there are any laws pertaining to obtaining dual citizenship from your country of current citizenship, right? So other countries may have laws where you can't be a dual citizen, but from the Canadian point of view, you are able to hold dual citizenship. The next question I get is, can I apply for citizenship now, even though I will not have 3 years of residence until next month? And so the context behind this is, we understand that the processing time is taking 12 months. So is it possible to submit the application a little bit early, so that when the officer is actually assessing the application, by that time the individual would have the full 3 years, the 1,095 days? Unfortunately, no. So at the time that the application forms are signed and the application is submitted, the physical presence requirement, the 1,095 days, needs to have already been met. Okay, so anything beyond that is additional days, but at the time that the application is, the forms are signed and the application is submitted, you need to have already accumulated that 1,095 days. Otherwise, the application will be rejected, will be returned, right? It won't be considered, it can't be evaluated if you don't have that 1,095 days. Can I apply for citizenship the day that I meet the residency requirement? Technically, the answer is yes. Technically, as soon as you have the 1,095 days, you're eligible, if you meet the other requirements, of course, you're eligible to submit that citizenship application. However, from a practical side, a tip would be to wait, give yourself some buffer time. So don't submit it on that 1,095 or 1,096 day. Give yourself some extra time. What I've seen in my practice is that sometimes we forget, or we have missed the travel dates by a day. You know, we think that we arrived on the 25th of March, but really it was the 27th. It happens. Going back 5 years can sometimes be daunting, especially for individuals who have a large travel history. And so from a practical point of view, we always advise individuals to not submit the day that they meet the residency requirements. Give yourself some buffer time, okay? Give yourself some buffer time. So in case there's a couple days that you've missed or trip that you've missed, you'll still be eligible to meet the residency requirement, because you've had that additional 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever amount of time that it may be as a buffer when you submitted and signed that application. So what happens if your application is returned or refused? Is it possible to reapply? And how long does an applicant need to wait before they can submit their second application or their subsequent application? Generally, there's no required amount of time. So at any point in time after you've received your application, you can submit a new application, but highly advised to ensure that you address any of the issues that are in that initial application. So why was it returned? Why was it refused? Make sure those are addressed before you submit that subsequent application. What documents can I use to demonstrate the language requirement? Well, on IRCC's website for the citizenship application, they've outlined exactly which documents are accepted in demonstrating the language requirement. So I advise you go back, take a look at the document checklist that IRCC has put out, and look at exactly what it is that they will accept for demonstrating that language requirement. Traveling. So can I leave Canada after I mail my application, right? So once that application is submitted, the residence requirement has been met. Can I live outside of Canada? Can I travel at that point? Yes, you can leave Canada. There's no requirement that you be remaining in Canada or continue living in Canada throughout the time that your application is being processed. However, if you need to take the knowledge test, the Canadian knowledge test, or when you are looking to do that citizenship ceremony, both of those are only held in Canada. So you will need to be able to travel back to Canada at the time that your test or your ceremony is scheduled. So remember, yes, it is okay to travel, it is okay to be outside of Canada, but when your test is scheduled, when your citizenship ceremony is scheduled, you will need to be able to return to Canada to take both of those, because those will not be held outside of Canada. Oh, so this one goes to the next question. Can I take the citizenship test from outside of Canada? Again, no, you can't. That is only done inside of Canada. What happens if I fail the knowledge test? So going to that citizenship knowledge test, what happens if for whatever reason you fail it? It's okay. Applicants have 2 opportunities to pass the written knowledge test. After the second attempt, if they still fail, then they may be scheduled for a hearing with the citizenship officer where an oral version of the test will be administered. And if there's a special need that an individual has and wants to have accommodated, please make sure that you're addressing those in the beginning when you're starting that submission of the application, because that's the only way that IRCC will take those into account. Once the citizenship test is done, how long is it before the ceremony? Generally, we see it about 3 to 6 months after the citizenship test. But of course, every individual case is going to vary. And so it will really depend on when yours is scheduled for. And really the entire processing time, like I said, should be about 12 months from the start till that ceremony itself. And of course, important today, what's the current impacts of COVID-19 on citizenship applications? They are still being processed. Citizenship applications are still being received. They're still being processed. Okay, IRCC has confirmed that these applications are still continuing in terms of being processed. However, we are going to be seeing delays, right? Due to COVID-19, there are delays across the board in every type of immigration application. So the processing may take longer than the 12 months. Additionally, right now, IRCC has canceled all of the in-person citizenship ceremonies. So if your application is approved, you may be waiting a little longer to get that ceremony date, because right now, like I said, there are no citizenship ceremonies happening. So that's where we're seeing the biggest impact right now in terms of from COVID. Additionally, some people are having issues attaining documents, right? In terms of, for example, the language test. Would not recommend submitting the citizenship application without the language test. That is a vital component of the application if you are between the ages of 18 and 54. And with that, we have finished the frequently asked questions that I have, and I'll turn it back to Fargunda.
Thank you very much, Zia. We have actually a lot of questions online, so I'll just ask you the ones that are related to citizenship application. So the first question is, what if I hold a British passport? Do I still require to pass the English language test for citizenship?
Yes, great question. It is still required. So regardless of what country you are a citizen of right now, that language component, if you're between the ages of 18 and 54, is going to be part of the application.
Awesome, thank you. So the second question is whether or not we can apply online for citizenship.
Unfortunately not. unfortunately not. IRCC has not moved the citizenship application process online. It still requires us to print out the application forms, compile the entire application package, and mail it out to IRCC.
Awesome. If I travel to the US on a daily basis, does that count towards 1,000 days?
Good question. So what we're talking about when we're looking at counting your days is any day that you've spent even a portion of that day in Canada. So you've physically been present on Canadian soil, any part of a day will ensure that that day counts towards your 1,095 days. So if you're traveling daily, if you're going back and forth from the States on a daily basis, as long as you've spent some part of that day in Canada, then that will count towards your 1,095 days.
Awesome. The other question is about the tax returns. So I came to Canada in 2017, December 2017. Does my tax return for 2017, which was a zero income tax return, count as the 3-year requirement?
Good question. So again, it comes down to when you're looking at, or what years you're looking to use towards your physical presence, right? What I recommend is all those years that you're using towards your physical presence, you should, if you are required to file taxes in those years, then those will be a requirement for your application.
Awesome. I've given English test before I moved to Canada, and it is now expired. Do I need to give that test again? I was on a student permit before.
Great. IRCC has actually allowed expired language tests to be acceptable for the purposes of citizenship. So I recommend going back to IRCC's website, and they have actually a tool on there that will allow you to go through exactly what documents they will accept. Expired, for example, IELTS or CELPIP tests, if it's the general version or the citizenship version, are acceptable for the purposes of citizenship.
Awesome. The same question, we had another question about IELTS. I think you answered that question as well, because they're asking if the IELTS is an acceptable
Yes.
of English. Awesome. Sorry, we have a lot of questions. So we have a lot of questions related to immigration. So we will be addressing that either on our next session, or you can actually write us an email and we will respond accordingly. We're actually prioritizing based on questions related to citizenship. So do we require to provide police check certificate, police report certificate?
Good question. It depends. It depends on where you have or how many days you've spent in that country. The actual checklist spells it out in terms of giving you the exact number of days. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but go back to the checklist. It specifically says if you've spent a certain number of days in a particular country in the past 5 years, then you will be required to provide a police certificate from that country.
So if we are outside Canada, can we apply for citizenship, I believe?
So yes, being outside of Canada, like I said, the biggest thing with applicants who may be living outside or traveling outside afterwards is being able to come back to Canada, right? It is really important that once you have the test date or the citizenship ceremony date, that you are able to return, right? So that might mean needing a valid PR card for certain applicants. And so that's really very important in order to be able to apply when you're residing, like if you want to be able to reside outside of Canada throughout the process.
How long does it take for the application to process altogether?
Right now, again, this is pre-COVID times, the average processing was supposed to be about 12 months. And we were seeing for the large part that IRCC was sticking to that. Right now, with the delays that we're going to be seeing from COVID, it's unknown what the effect will be in terms of processing times, but the average processing time pre-COVID was 12 months.
Okay, thank you. How does work permit before getting PR counts toward Canadian citizenship eligibility days?
Yeah, so when we talked about looking at the days, we said you need 1,095 days. And time as a temporary resident, if it's within the past 5 years, can count towards that physical presence. But the way it's calculated is that every day you spent as a temporary resident counts as half a day towards the physical presence, up to a maximum credit of a year. Now, when I say temporary resident, that includes foreign workers who are here on a work permit.
Thank you. How can I get travel history to calculate my time in Canada? I have been traveling to US back and forth through land border, and I don't have dates of my travel.
Good question. So right now, what you can actually do is the US government keeps for any port of entry that you've entered for the States, there's actually a record that you can access online. It is very simple to get. You're basically putting in your personal information, like your passport number, and you're able to get a comprehensive list of all your entry and exit dates from the US. So that's one way to get your travel history if you're only traveling between Canada and the States. Okay, so you can go online, US government website, and there's an ability to get a comprehensive list of all the dates. Now, that obviously will not include travel outside of Canada and the US, right? So if you're traveling internationally, that won't be included in there. You can apply to Canada Border Services Agency for a list of all your dates, but they will only include, they're not always, they can take a really long time to get. And so it's easier if you have a travel journal with all your dates in it, or if you're able to go back and take a look at possibly like boarding tickets or credit card receipts or anything else that you might have in your emails, for example, or look at your passport stamps. All of that will be helpful because it is difficult to get from Canada Border Services Agency. It does take a while. The US one is easy. It's just the international one that can take a little longer.
Okay, thank you. So the other question is, I took the language test while applying for PR. Would I still have to take the language test again for the citizenship application?
So not necessarily. If you meet the requirements, if you have the CLB-4, then you can use expired tests for the purposes of citizenship applications.
Okay, great. The other question is about whether or not there are any change due to COVID-19 on the time a PR needs to reside in Canada. I think you have addressed this already, but if you could please.
Yeah, no, as of right now, there's nothing that's been announced. It may come in the future if IRCC decides to, but right now there's nothing. Right now it's just the impacts that we're seeing are in terms of delays in processing times, and right now not having those citizenship ceremonies.
Thank you. Can I travel after applying for citizenship? I'm in that 12 months when the process is going on. So when I apply for citizenship, basically, can I apply right after and still be eligible because it's not filled in the form?
Yeah, so you can, like I said, you can travel while you're waiting for your citizenship process or the processing to happen. That's completely fine. Just make sure that you're able to be here the date that you have the citizenship test and the citizenship ceremony, but traveling is completely fine.
Okay, thank you. I have been a PR since the year 2000, but in the last 5 years don't meet the 1,096 days because working for a Canadian company outside Canada. How can I still be eligible?
That's a tough one. Unfortunately, for maintaining your status as a permanent resident, there are exceptions to the physical presence requirement. They're even more limited in terms of when you're looking to try and use dates that you've spent outside of Canada towards your citizenship physical presence, and working for a Canadian employer, unfortunately, is not part of that. So you would have to physically accumulate 1,095 days in Canada before you're able to apply.
Thank you. At what point is the language and other citizenship test taken? Can the test be taken prior to completion of 1,095 days? Do the tests have any validity to it?
Yeah, so the language test can be taken at any point. Like I said, you can use the expired tests for qualifying, and you have to be able to demonstrate that you meet the language requirements at the time that you submit your application. The citizenship knowledge test is one that you're invited to. So after IRCC has said, yes, we've received your application, it's complete, it's now in processing, then they will invite you to come take the knowledge test. So it's not one that you can pre-schedule or take in advance. It would have to be taken once you're invited. So after you've submitted your application, it's been deemed complete, and then they're inviting you to take that test.
Thank you. Any documents you would recommend that we should include in addition to the checklist?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, it really does depend on each individual's circumstances. So it's not possible, while the document checklist that IRCC has published is a good starting point, like I said, definitely want to make sure that you cover all your bases, but it's not possible to say, okay, here's everything you'll need and you'll have a complete application and everything will be fine, because it really does depend on your background and your history.
Thank you. I think we addressed this question, but in case they have joined us later, if you could answer if the police certificate is required.
Yeah, so the police certificate is required only if you spent a certain number of days in that country. What I recommend is going back to the document checklist and taking a look at exactly what that threshold is. And if you do meet that threshold, then yes, you would be required to, but otherwise, no.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of questions related to immigration that I actually did not ask you. We might be able to address those questions during our immigration session.
Sounds good. Perfect.
Since we are running out of time, thank you very much for all your questions, and thank you very much, Zia, for the presentation. Please be aware that, again, this session will be recorded and has been recorded, and will be soon shared on iicanada.org/webinars. You can watch the recording and send us email to your respective regional members. You can also call Access Line, and you will be directed to one of our members. The Access Line information is currently on your screens. I thank you very much, Zia and Turaj, for joining us today. Zia, do you have anything else to add for today's session?
That's it. Thank you again for joining. Hope you found it informative. And like Facundo said, we know we've received a lot of questions with regards to immigration, and we'll make sure to address those after. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yali Madad.
Yali Madad.